Don't know what you're saying. You're flying higher than a plane, and I'm not complaining. It's getting too loud, we'll figure it out. I'm out of my brain.
Today I want to talk about a dilemma which is called lifeboat ethics. In 1974, Garrett Hardin presented this dilemma to the world in the form of a metaphor.
Dr. Garrett Hardin, Professor Emeritus of Human Ecology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's the author of numerous scientific and popular works.
So, the lifeboat dilemma is very focused on ethics and equality and whose right it is to use resources. The main question that Hardin tries to bring to light with his dilemma is, does everyone on Earth have the equal right to an equal share of the resources that the Earth offers? And if not, or even if so, how do we divide these resources? So, to quote Hardin's explanation of the dilemma literally, he states that if we divide the world crudely into rich nations and poor nations, 2/3 of them are desperately poor and only 1/3 comparatively, with the United States the wealthiest of all. Metaphorically, each rich nation can be seen as a lifeboat full of comparatively rich people. In the ocean outside of each lifeboat swim the poor of the world, who would like to get in or at least to share some of the wealth. What should the lifeboat passengers do? So, to get our cast straight, the rich Western countries are on the lifeboats, the third world countries are in the sea, there are not enough resources which play the role of space on the lifeboats to save everyone. So the biggest problem is limited space, which in real life is the limited resources to make everyone rich, wealthy, and happy. What should the rich people do? They have a few options. For instance, they could let a few poor people on the lifeboats and let them be happy with them. Or they could ignore everyone else and save themselves and build like a fence around the lifeboats so that none of the poor people could get in. Or they can just drop the boats and go live in the sea, but that's not a really realistic option. Because being completely honest, humans are very self-centered and they won't help others if it endangers themselves. So, two options left, which makes a dilemma. So the dilemma is, should the swimmers be taken, and if so, under what circumstances? To analyze and deconstruct this dilemma, step one was to put it into my frame of reference. So I had to think about why we even have this dilemma in the first place. And for me, the dilemma represents the international system and post-colonialism. It portrays the rich Western countries on a lifeboat, which is how they see themselves, and sadly it is also quite close to the reality. This dilemma had to be there in the first place because we live in a world that is dominated by capitalism, which means that there always has to be some kind of hierarchy. Additionally, it's very put into place because of old colonial relations between the West and other countries, because these older relations automatically put the West above other countries, and I'd say that without these colonial relationships from the past, the West wouldn't be as high up as they are right now, or as powerful as they are right now. Also, Western countries see countries that have a different system and different values than they have as failed states. Thus, when a state acts differently from the Western norm, they are immediately a failed state, which is not necessarily the truth, and this is very critiqued by green critics. Just because they have a separate way of doing things doesn't mean that it's wrong. I wanted to add something as I wasn't as clear as I thought in the original video. These failed states would usually be seen as the countries in the sea, but this is a very Western perspective, and I want you to keep that in mind, as maybe for other parts in the world, these wouldn't be the countries in the sea. Statements like this could put the dilemma in a whole different perspective, where the poorer countries aren't necessarily the most helpless one, and the richer countries on the lifeboats aren't necessarily doing themselves any favors. However, for now, I say that the main thing is that the dilemma is caused by colonial relations from the past, because the Western countries had the opportunity to control natural resources that didn't even necessarily belong to them. And that plays a huge role in why the West is now so powerful, rich, and wealthy. Step 2 was trying the actual thought experiment out. What would I do if I were on a lifeboat? Which is really hard to say, because I would love to say that I would save everyone or even abandon all the lifeboats and try to come up with a smart solution with everyone that's in the sea and all the bright minds that are there. So I realized that I didn't clearly state my personal preference, but I hope that I wouldn't be able to live with myself being on one of the lifeboats while other people are dying. So I would go for equality in either one of the ways, where everyone will end up in the water, whatever happens. And I don't believe that humans are fundamentally good. But I do believe that it's human nature to crave power, which is why I don't think that this answer is very realistic, and I feel like it's proven by the way that communism was brought into this world, and especially how it ended. As this idea of economic equality comes very close to the fundamentals of communism, where everyone's equal on an economic level, where thus people gave up their self-interest for the common good. This collective act would improve the commonwealth of people, but as we've seen in historical events, it doesn't really work like that, as humans will always crave power. Looking into what Hardin said about this, he presented the tragedy of the commons.
The tragedy of the commons is concerned with the problem of allocation of resources. So it's either socialism or private property. Either one of those may work, but the unmanaged commons cannot possibly work once the population gets above a certain size.
Basically, he states that economic equality for everyone wouldn't work because every individual puts self-interest before a small negative effect for the general interest, and this can lead to overexploitation and underutilization. In this consideration, Hardin starts warning the world for overpopulation, which is definitely not something that we want and which would be the outcome of this.
The standard of living that Americans enjoy today cannot possibly hold for the entire present population of the earth. The number of people have to be reduced, and or the American standard of living has to go down.
Step 3 was to place the dilemma into the real world. So as I've mentioned before, I would define the rich Western countries to be on the lifeboats and third world countries to be in the water. Natural resources were often originally from third world countries. So to stay within Hardin's thought experiment, the people in the sea would start with lifeboats of their own, but they're inflated and they don't know how to make them work. And then the West would step in and find some way to make these lifeboats work for them and kind of take them away from the third world countries. This way, the lifeboats won't work for the third world countries, even though they are the ones to originally have them. As without buyers and economical relations, resources would mean something else, and it wouldn't make them rich. As I mentioned before as well, due to colonial relations, Western countries had this opportunity to take it from them and give the resources a different meaning to make themselves look rich. Honestly, it's impossible to find a good solution for the dilemma. There are just not enough resources on the world to make every country rich, and if there were, we would stump upon the tragedy of the commons and create overpopulation and exploitation. But still, it's a very good and important thing to think about, because there only has to be one large wave and all the lifeboats sink.
Your t-shirt is ripped and it's all the same. You don't know my name. It's getting too loud, we'll figure it out.